As you've probably heard me say in the past, I'm not a big fan of contracts in the residential business. Commercial's different. I'm talking specifically about residential. And one of the big arguments for contracts is so that you receive your revenue over a 12-month period, because the argument is during the downtime, during the off-season, during the slower months, there isn't as much money coming in, and those contracts provide for great off-season revenue to keep things running and smooth out cash flow. My basic argument is that it doesn't make sense to put yourself under a contract with the client so that they can be your savings account and make sure that you don't overspend in the months that bring in a lot of revenue and therefore not have enough money in the slow season. That's your job, my job as a business owner, to self-regulate ourselves and make sure that we have set aside enough money to get us through the slow time. So I want to give an idea to how to solve this problem without requiring all of your clients be under a contract. There's probably things you could refute in my example. There's probably things I haven't thought through. I tried to put this together pretty quick to communicate a concept. And the idea comes from a number of Service Autopilot Academy members asked my opinion of a book called Profit First. And the premise of that book is that you set aside some percentage of your revenue into a profit account, a separate bank account, and that forces you to save profit. And then with what's left over, you actually live or run your company off that money. And so it's a forced savings plan. It's a forced plan to create profit in your business and not overspend. Well, that concept gave me an idea that could apply to many individuals to solve this contract revenue problem. And that's what I want to show you real quick. So imagine that you have all of your revenue under contract and it generates $40,000 per month. That means you're a $480,000 per year company. For simplicity, imagine that you have eliminated all contracts and you're going to get paid as you perform the work. And I realize you could make arguments that the client will either spend more or less depending on whether or not they're under a contract. But just let's assume that they spend the exact same amount of money and weather doesn't move against you and you could make the exact same amount of money, which I believe you can. And so what you would see with your revenue is let's call this January and February, and even into March, in my fictitious example, revenue is down as compared to the contract months. And then it's up. It's up 11% for 7 months of the year, and then it's down again in November, and it's down again in December. And so the idea is that you need some of the money from the 7 months set aside so that you can, the 7 months that outperform what you would have received under contract, you need some of that money set aside so that when November, December, January, and February arrive, you have the cash left over to deal with it, to deal with those months. And so swiping the idea from the Profit First book that doesn't talk about this but uses the example of setting aside profit, what you could do is you could create a checking account and take a percentage of that money every month during your months that yield a lot of additional revenue over what they would have yielded if the revenue was coming through contract revenue, and I'll better explain that in a moment. And you can move some percentage of money to essentially a savings account. And the reason why I think this is an issue for many companies is because a lot of companies look at their bank accounts and they determine how much money they have left over to spend. So they look at the account, I've got 50 grand in the account, we can afford to do this. I've got 10,000 and payroll's coming, I can't afford to do anything right now. And a lot of decisions are made that way, which isn't how it should work, but that's the reality of it. And that's why when you're not self-regulating, or in my example here, potentially moving some money to a separate account, you think you have more money than you do, and then when you get to your lean months, you're in trouble. So the basic idea is that your money, as you're depositing checks or charging credit cards, is going into your checking account. You're living out of that account. And then during the months of the year where you actually bill more revenue than you would have had all of your revenue been coming through a contract, you would take a percentage of your money out of your checking account every month and move it to your savings account. So in my example, we have 7 months, and this isn't that complicated. You could figure it out in advance. So in my example, 7 months of the year, we're generating $53,000 a month instead of 40 because our revenue isn't equalized through contract installment payments. So in other words, we're bringing in roughly 25% more revenue from April through October, I believe, in my example here, than we would had the revenue been under contract. So the simple concept would be that at the end of each month, you take 25% of the revenue and you move it to a savings account that can't be touched or could only be touched for an emergency. And that way, when you arrive in November, for the last 7 months, you've been taking money out of your account to build your off-season fund. This essentially forces you to save the money so you don't get yourself in trouble. And during the 7 months of the year when you're making a lot more money than you would have had everything been under contract, you are very clear, you're crystal clear, in fact, about how much money you really have to work with because that's all that remains in your checking account. Now, if 25% sounds really scary, you could test this concept by just simply doing something like 10%. You could start next year just setting aside 10% of your revenue. Again, you have to run your numbers and figure out how much additional revenue you actually would bring in. So you have to say, as a company, we're going to generate about this much money for the year, and you have to do a little bit of math and figure out how much you need to set aside. But there's some amount that you could pick that's super conservative. Like in my example, 10% is super conservative. That's less than half of the actual additional revenue you're earning. I mean, you're earning 25% more in my example per month than you would have been had you had your revenue under contract. So if 25% sounds too aggressive, maybe you just make up a number, a small number to start with, and you start setting that aside every month in those months that, as I said, generate a lot of additional revenue. It may or may not be an idea that works for you, but I've heard this argument so many times, and I wanted to just throw this concept out there. It's something to think about, see if it would work for you. It's a way to force yourself to save the money to make sure you don't get yourself in any trouble. And if you get to the end of the year and you make it through all the lean months and you don't have to touch your savings account, you've just created a nice big profit account for you of additional money that you just made for yourself to put in your own bank account, or money that you could then take and reinvest in the business to grow it even bigger. So there's a lot of pluses to this concept.